On this news review, the FBI has accidentally revealed the identity of a former Saudi embassy official in the U.S. who was suspected of giving crucial support to two al-Qaeda hijackers in the September 11 attacks. According to Yahoo News, the disclosure was made in a recent declaration filed in a federal court by a senior FBI official. The agent did so by mistake in response to a lawsuit from families of victims who accused Saudi Arabia of complicity in the attacks. The document names Mussaed Ahmed al Jarrah, who is a mid-level Saudi foreign ministry official at the embassy. Jarrah is suspected of ordering two people to help the hijackers settle in the U.S. ahead of the attacks. Jarrah's whereabouts are currently unknown. Families of victims say the revelation shows there has been a cover-up of the Saudi involvement. Well, joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have investigative journalist Tony Gosling joining us from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, welcome to the program. Give us your thoughts on the information that's been revealed, how substantial and significant it is, and if you may, about how it was revealed, the issue of the FBI accidentally revealing the identity of a former Saudi embassy official in the U.S. who had some connections to the 9/11 attacks.
Through Osama bin Laden, Saudi citizen, we have known for many, many years that there was a big Saudi connection to the September the 11th attacks. But this is the first time I've seen actually an official at the Saudi embassy in Washington was supporting those who would later go on to carry out the hijackings. Now, I mean, this is an enormous revelation. And of course, all of the journalists are a little skeptical as to whether this is an accidental or a deliberate leak. The way these things work is if there are reasons that the US administration wants to put pressure on Saudi Arabia, they may deliberately leak little tidbits like this. Now, this I call it a tidbit, but this evidence points to the September the 11th attacks actually being an act of war against the United States with the involvement of the Saudi government. Now, that is a very serious consideration that many of us have been pointing to evidence of that for many years. But this is the first real cast iron evidence that we've seen that the Saudi embassy in Washington was almost certainly involved in quite an important way with some of the key people who were the September the 11th attackers. But as to whether it may be a deliberate or accidental leak, I veer towards deliberate, because we've got an increasing tension right now between the US and Saudi Arabia, really to do with the oil price. And the US is putting pressure on the Saudis in many ways to stop the enormous amount of oil pumping that they're doing in order to depress the price of oil. Now, this is a disaster for the US shale industry, etc. And Trump has already pulled out a whole load of troops that he only just recently put into Saudi Arabia to bolster the regime there. So Saudi Arabia is actually really relying a lot at the moment on Western support, both from the British and the Americans. And they've already withdrawn just a few days ago a whole load of troops. So they're basically saying to the Saudis, unless you do as we say, play ball, then we may just withdraw all of our support, in which case your regime will rather quickly crumble. So this, I think, could be a deliberate leak. And what happens basically is the director of the FBI gets a call from the White House, and he will say to a journalist, he'll call a journalist anonymously maybe, and say, well, there's something very interesting coming out in these court papers, alerting the journalists to have a specific look at that. And that may be how this has happened, because the tensions at the moment are enormous between Saudi Arabia and the US, and revealing an act of war that the Saudis look to be involved with against the US is a very, very good way of putting pressure on that relationship and on the Saudi royal family to start doing what the Americans want them to do.
Thank you. Joining us now from Bali's international lawyer, Barry Rossman. Mr. Rossman, welcome to the program. Give us your thoughts on the information that was apparently leaked and how it was revealed.
What I will say is I think there's one individual whose career as a government lawyer has clearly come to an end. How it came to be released, I don't know. It's a kind of mistake that you wouldn't expect anyone to make. One could speculate whether it was done intentionally out of sympathy with the 9/11 plaintiffs or whether it was genuinely an accident, but we're left in this situation. And it's important to understand that certainly until very recently, the question of whether Americans could sue a foreign sovereign state was determined entirely by the Foreign Sovereignty Immunity Act. And that act had been amended largely for political reasons, first in 1976 and then again in 1988, to create an exception where the State Department designated a nation as a state sponsor of terror. Absent that certification, there was no way for anyone, any individual, to sue a foreign state in the U.S. court system. But that added an exception. Now, the fact that there were exceptions that allowed Americans to sue foreign states already put the United States outside of the international norm. In most countries, individuals simply have no ability to do that. But more recently, something quite fantastic has happened in the United States in that legislation that was put forward and initially vetoed by the Obama administration, ultimately passed by Congress, creating a further blanket exception that allows plaintiffs to sue foreign sovereign states in connection with acts of terrorism. And that's where we're at now as a result of that act passed in 2016 with overwhelming support in Congress, essentially created an exception arising out of the 9/11 case, I might add, the political fallout of it, allowing plaintiffs to sue a foreign state which would otherwise have sovereign immunity in connection with an act of terrorism. So the question arises here really is to what extent will the courts allow that new exception to be applied retroactively in order to facilitate this case against Saudi Arabia, bearing in mind that they'll probably take the view that it's a mere procedural matter, which therefore can be applied retroactively. And then we come to the real meat and potatoes of the matter, which is the provisions in the new legislation, which entitle the Attorney General of the United States to intervene and in effect stay any proceedings which would otherwise be able to be pursued in order to negotiate with the foreign sovereign state in question. And depending on what view is taken of this new evidence and whether in fact a view prevails that would see the support that was given as having been provided officially by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as opposed to an individual acting outside the scope of his ordinary duties, then we're likely to see some serious political activity behind the scenes as the U.S. apparatus, that is the law enforcement apparatus and the political apparatus, negotiate with their counterparts in Saudi Arabia in order to reach some kind of a political resolution which is satisfactory to the plaintiffs in the case.
Thanks a lot, gentlemen. Investigative journalist Tony Gossing joining us from Bristol. Also thanks to international lawyer Mr. Barry Grossman speaking to us from Bali. And with that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review. Do stay tuned, though. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV. Bye for now.